She was brilliant, ambitious, and bold, and she lost her head for it. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, she didn't just wear a crown. She sparked a revolution that shook the foundations of England forever. But who was she really? A seductress? A reformer? A queen? Or a pawn? Stay tuned, because her story isn't just about love and betrayal. It's about power, faith, and a legacy that changed the world. Hi guys, and thanks for tuning in. In tonight's video, we'll uncover the fascinating rise and tragic fall of Anne Boleyn. From her dazzling days at court to the moment the axe fell at the Tower of London. But before we dive in, if you enjoy this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place and let's get started. Before she was the Queen of England, or the most talked about woman at court, Anne Boleyn was simply the daughter of an ambitious English nobleman with powerful connections. Born sometime between 1501 and 1507, yeah, the records are a bit fuzzy. Anne was likely born at either Bleakling Hall in Norfolk or Hever Castle in Kent, the seat of the Boleyn family. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, fluent in several languages and eager to climb the ranks of Tudor society. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard. She came from one of England's most noble families, which made Anne's bloodline respectable, if not exactly royal. From a young age, Anne was marked for a life at court, but not the English court. Well, at least not yet. Around the age of 12 or 13, she was sent abroad to the Netherlands, and then to the glittering court of Margaret of Austria, one of the most educated women in Europe. There, Anne gained a reputation for intelligence, wit, and charm. And she wasn't just learning manners and music. She was being shaped into a Renaissance woman. Soon after, she traveled to France, where she spent several years serving Queen Claude. This was Anne's true finishing school. She immersed herself in French fashion, poetry, and progressive ideas about religion and female virtue, all of which she would later bring back to England. By the time Anne returned to her homeland around 1522, she wasn't just another lady in waiting. She was polished, poised, and politically savvy. And soon, the English court would take notice. In 1522, Anne Boleyn returned to England, older, wiser, and far more refined than when she left. She wasn't the wide-eyed daughter of a nobleman anymore. She was worldly, she was confident, and she was completely fluent in the art of courtly politics. She was quickly placed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's Spanish-born first wife. And while she started in the Queen's shadow, it didn't take long for Anne to stand out. Unlike many women at court, Anne didn't rely on beauty alone. She was stylish, fluent in French, and razor-sharp in conversation. While some found her charm irresistible, others, well, they found her a little bit too bold, too opinionated. But, that was Anne's power. At first, her heart belonged elsewhere. She became romantically involved with Henry Percy, but the match was quickly broken off, likely under pressure from Cardinal Wolsey, the king's right-hand man. It was Anne's first lesson in just how ruthless life at court can be. But still, she didn't fade into the background. She wouldn't. And it wasn't long before the most powerful man in the country, King Henry VIII himself, began to take notice. But Anne, she wasn't like the other woman the king had pursued. She didn't fall into his arms. She refused his gifts. She denied his advances. And that, perhaps more than anything, made her unforgettable. Anne wasn't aiming to be a mistress. She was aiming for the crown. Before she turned the king's head, Anne Boleyn, she served the queen. As a lady-in-waiting at Catherine of Aragon, Anne became part of the inner circle of the most powerful woman in England. Her role, it wasn't just ceremonial. It was demanding, prestigious, and essential to the daily functioning of the royal household. Anne would have helped the queen with her dress, entertained her with music or conversation, attended her public and private ceremonies, and managed some of the day-to-day logistics of her court. Think of her as a personal assistant, event coordinator, and cultural ambassador, all wrapped into one very well-dressed courtier. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to be graceful, clever, discreet, and above all, loyal. But this wasn't just a one-sided job. While Anne served the queen, she was perfectly placed to network with powerful courtiers, gain visibility, and build her influence in a court where reputation meant everything. With her French elegance and sharp intelligence, she stood out. She became known for her wit, her sense of style, especially her daring French headdresses, and her ability to hold her own in a room full of nobles. She was observant, calculating even, and she understood that court life was a chessboard, and every move counted. What no one could have known, not even Anne herself, was that the next move she made would upend the lives of everyone around her, including the queen that she served. It began quietly, a glance, a dance, a conversation. Sometime around 1525, King Henry VIII began to take special interest in Anne Boleyn. At first, it might have seemed just like another court flirtation. Henry was known for his wandering eye and already had a mistress, Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. Before Anne Boleyn ever caught the king's eye, it was her sister, Mary, who had already been there. Yes, you heard that correctly. Anne's sister, of all people. Mary Boleyn, the eldest of the Boleyn sisters, arrived at the English court around the same time as Anne, or maybe possibly a little bit earlier. Like her sister, she had spent time in France. Rumors swirled that Mary had been romantically involved with the King Francis I of France, who was said to have called her his English mare. I wouldn't exactly call that a compliment. When she returned to England, she was married off to William Carey, a courtier with a respectable position. But that didn't stop her from catching the attention of King Henry VIII. Their affair began likely around 1522, shortly after her marriage. But how long did it last? Well, we're not sure. How serious is it? Well, that's also unclear. What we do know is that Mary was Henry's mistress, discreetly, and likely with her family's approval. Some historians believe that one, or even both of Mary's children, Catherine and Henry Carey, may have been fathered by the king, though he never officially acknowledged them. Unlike later royal mistresses, Mary didn't receive grand titles or properties, and once the affair faded, so did her place in the spotlight. But her brief relationship with Henry would have lasting consequences, because it placed the Boleyn family directly in the king's inner circle, giving them influence, visibility, and ambition. Ironically, Mary's affair may have paved the way for her sister's rise, and ultimately, her fall. And as Anne began her ascent, Mary would be quietly pushed into the background, living in the shadow of a sister who would one day wear the crown and lose everything for it. But unlike Mary, Anne didn't yield to the king's attention. She didn't swoon, she didn't flatter, she simply resisted. And in doing so, she became unforgettable. For a man like Henry, who was used to getting what he wanted, Anne's defiance, it was intoxicating. He began to write to her love letters filled with longing, jealousy, and frustration. In one, he declared he'd been more than a year struck by the dart of love. and signed it with a heart. These letters, full of passion and pleading, reveal a king not used to being denied. Anne played a masterful game. She accepted the king's attention, but she refused to become his mistress, whether it was ambition, morality, or strategy, or perhaps all three. She made it clear. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to make her queen. This bold refusal only deepened his obsession. But there was one enormous obstacle: Queen Catherine of Aragon. Henry had been married to Catherine for nearly 20 years. She was deeply respected, devoutly Catholic, and had once been the great love of his life. But she had failed to give him a male heir, and Henry saw this, or at least claimed to, as a sign that the marriage was cursed in God's eyes. Conveniently, falling in love with Anne gave him a reason to pursue what would become known as the Great King's Matter, his attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine. What began as infatuation soon became an obsession so powerful it would tear apart a kingdom, separate England from the Catholic Church, and set Anne Boleyn on a path to a throne, and eventually to a scaffold. By the mid-1520s, King Henry VIII, he was growing desperate. His marriage to the Queen had failed, at least in his eyes. They had been together for nearly 2 decades, but all of Catherine's sons had died in infancy. Only one child, a daughter, Princess Mary, had survived. Henry was convinced this was more than a misfortune. He saw it as a divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. After all, Catherine had first been married to Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother. Though she insisted the marriage had never been consummated, Harry began to argue that their union violated biblical law. And conveniently, he had fallen deeply in love with Anne Boleyn. But Anne wasn't going to be another royal mistress. She wanted more. And Henry, well, he was determined to give it to her. So began what would be known as the King's Great Matter, a years-long campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine and make Anne his queen. At first, Henry believed it would be a simple matter of convincing the Pope. After all, kings had divorced before, and England had political clout. But there was an enormous problem. The Pope was under the control of Catherine's nephew, the most powerful man in Europe. Granting Henry's annulment would be an insult to the emperor, and that was just not a risk the Pope was willing to take. As months turned into years, Henry grew increasingly frustrated. He fired his trusted advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, for failing to secure the annulment. And under Anne's influence, Henry began to entertain radical new ideas, including those from Protestant reformers who claimed the Pope had no true authority over kings. With Anne by his side, Henry started challenging the church itself. What had begun as a love affair had now sparked a political and religious crisis, one that would tear England away from the Roman Catholic Church and reshape the monarchy forever. For Anne, this was more than just personal victory. She was now the future queen, and the woman who had captured the heart of a king and sent a nation ablaze. But power comes at a price, and for Anne Boleyn, the battle for the crown, well, it was just beginning. By late 1532, Anne Boleyn was no longer just the king's obsession. She was his partner, his confidant, and, though the public didn't know it, yet, she was his wife. The pressure was mounting. Years of failed negotiations with the Pope had left Henry bitter and determined to act on his own terms. And Anne, now in her early 30s, she was growing tired of waiting. In January of 1533, with Catherine finally out of the royal household and Henry's break with Rome in motion, Henry and Anne had secretly married, in a quiet ceremony, likely with only a few witnesses. The timing, it was no coincidence. Anne was already pregnant, and the stakes, well, they couldn't have been higher. Henry was convinced this child would be the long-awaited male heir he had tried and failed to have with Catherine. The urgency was clear. Their marriage, it needed to be made official, and quickly. In the eyes of the English Church, now separated from Rome, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's first marriage invalid and the union with Anne fully legitimate. But the rest of Europe, they weren't buying it. To the Catholic world, Anne was no queen. She was the king's mistress, now visibly pregnant, wearing a crown that didn't belong to her. But inside England, Henry didn't care what anyone thought. In June 1533, he gave Anne the full treatment, a grand coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey, heavy with symbolism. She was the first queen to be crowned with St. Edward's crown, the crown of a monarch, not just a consort. And as she processed through the streets of London, visibly expecting, the message was quite clear. This child is the future of England. But, as fate would have it, fate had other plans. On June 1st of 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England, a moment of triumph, but also one of controversy. After years of scandal, whispers, and political upheaval, Anne was no longer just the king's mistress. She was his wife, publicly and officially. And more than that, she was visibly 6 months pregnant. Her coronation was unlike any other queen's before her. It wasn't a quiet church affair. It was a 4-day royal spectacle designed to showcase her legitimacy, her glory, and above all, the future heir she carried. The streets of London were scrubbed and decorated. Fountains flowed with wine. Pageants filled the city, some in her honor, others less enthusiastic. Because while some celebrated, others stood away. Many nobles, loyal to Catherine, refused to attend. To them, Anne wasn't a queen. She was just a woman who had replaced the rightful one. The people were divided. She was loved by few, but she was watched by all. But still, Anne stood tall. Draped in crimson velvet, she processed to Westminster Abbey, where she was crowned by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. In a bold move, she was crowned not just as a consort, but with the St. Edward's crown, traditionally reserved for reigning monarchs. It was a symbolic declaration. Anne wasn't just the king's wife. She was the mother of England's future. But behind the jewels and the triumph, tension simmered. Anne's power rested entirely on one promise, that she would give Henry a male heir. And with the eyes of a kingdom upon her and her swollen belly, her entire future rested on the child she was about to deliver. For a brief moment, in 1533, Anne Boleyn stood at the height of her power. She had overcome the impossible, risen from the daughter of a courtier to the Queen of England. And her enemies, well, they had all been forced to bow. But queenship came with more than a crown. Anne now had to command a divided court, win over a skeptical public, and most importantly, she had to deliver a son. Her early days as queen were a flurry of ceremony and expectation. She led charitable works, presided over elaborate court events, and worked closely with Henry on matters of religious reform. Together, they were ushering in a new era. Anne was a Protestant sympathizer, and her influence helped steer Henry further away from Rome. Reformist scholars like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, grew in power under her protection. But Anne wasn't universally loved. Many in court still refused to accept her as queen. Loyalists to Catherine and the Princess Mary saw Anne as a disruptor. She was often called the concubine behind closed doors, and sometimes not so behind closed doors. Anne responded the only way she knew how, with confidence and control. She elevated her family, promoted her allies, and removed rivals when she could. But every move she made earned her more and more enemies. Even within the king's court, there were whispers that Anne was too proud. She was too political. She was interfering with too much. Still, Henry was enchanted, at least for now. As Anne prepared for the birth of their first child, the tension was rising, because no matter how powerful she seemed, you guys, everything depended on one thing: delivering the son that Henry so desperately desired. On September 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, Queen Anne Boleyn gave birth to her first child. The court held its breath. The nation waited. And then the news came. Can you guys guess? It was a girl. Not the long-awaited male heir that King Henry VIII had risked everything for, but a daughter. She was named Elizabeth, after both of her grandmothers. The disappointment was quiet, but unmistakable. Let's rewind. Henry had broken with the Pope, defied Europe, and married Anne in the scandal of a century, all for what he believed would be the son to secure the Tudor dynasty. But still, the child was healthy, and Henry initially tried to mask his disappointment. He assured the court that sons would follow. After all, Catherine had given birth to a daughter first, too. Anne was also hopeful. She had done everything expected of a queen, married properly, been crowned, and now given birth to a legitimate heir, even if not the heir that everyone wanted. Elaborate christening ceremonies were held, with nobility in attendance, and gifts from foreign ambassadors. The baby princess was swaddled in fine linen and placed under the care of a full royal household. But behind the pageantry, cracks were forming. Anne's power rested on her ability to produce a son, and she knew it. One daughter wasn't enough to secure her future, or the dynasty. And from this moment forward, the clock, it was ticking. Elizabeth was loved, yes, but she was not what Henry had sacrificed a kingdom for. And Anne would soon learn that the same ambition that had lifted her to the throne could not protect her from the weight of the king's disappointment. After the birth of Princess Elizabeth, Queen Anne Boleyn still had one vital task ahead of her: deliver that son. At first, there was hope. Anne became pregnant again, and Henry's confidence returned. He made plans. He celebrated early. But in 1534, tragedy struck. Anne, she miscarried. There was no public mourning, no ceremony, only silence. Henry was disappointed, but he was patient. One loss could be forgiven. After all, Catherine also suffered multiple stillbirths, but then it happened again and again. By January of 1536, Anne suffered what would be her final and most devastating miscarriage. It was a boy, and she lost him on the very day of Catherine's funeral. For Henry, it felt like an omen. A boy had been enreached, and he was lost. And just like that, the man who had once defied the world for Anne began to drift away. Anne's wit, once charming, was now seen as sharp and argumentative. Her strong opinions, once admired, were now nagging. In the court, already divided, began to shift their loyalty elsewhere, toward a quiet, gentle lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. Henry's affections moved quickly, and Anne, she knew it. She tried to win him back with charm, with diplomacy, even with jealousy, but none of it worked. Henry, he was growing tired, and more dangerously, he was growing suspicious. Surrounded by enemies at court, increasingly isolated, and with no living son to secure her position, Anne was now more vulnerable than ever. And soon, those who had once cheered her rise would conspire to bring her to her fall. While Anne Boleyn fought to hold her place, another woman just waited super quietly in the wings. Jane. A lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne, Jane had been at court for years, present but never prominent. Unlike Anne, Jane was gentle, reserved, and obedient. Well, at least in Henry's eyes. She represented everything Anne no longer was: modest, soft-spoken, and above all, she wasn't controversial. It's unclear exactly when Henry's interest began, but by 1536, it was incredibly impossible to ignore. Jane played her role perfectly. She didn't chase the king, but she didn't entirely resist him either. When Henry sent her gifts, she returned them. When he wrote her letters, she responded with chastity and with grace. It was a familiar script, the very same tactics Anne had once used on him. And just like before, Henry was hooked. He began visiting Jane in private. She was placed in luxurious new quarters. Courtiers started bowing a little lower in her presence. For Anne, it was déjà vu. Only this time, she was the one watching it all happen. She tried to rally Henry's attention with affection, then with anger, then with tears. But the magic was gone. Henry had moved on, and this time, he wouldn't wait for years. With Jane quietly rising and Anne politically isolated, Henry began to look for a way out, but not through annulment, but through destruction. In May of 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn's world came crashing down. After nearly 3 years on the throne, her power was gone, and now her very life was in danger. The charges came suddenly: adultery, incest, high treason. According to the accusations, Anne had taken multiple lovers, including Mark Smeaton, a court musician, and George Boleyn, her own brother. The claims were shocking, unbelievable, and most likely completely false. But the truth doesn't matter. With Anne no longer useful and Jane Seymour waiting in the wings, Henry needed Anne out of the way, permanently, and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was ready to do all the dirty work. A network of confessions, forced under torture and intimidation, created a web of lies strong enough to bring the queen down. And on May 2nd of 1536, Anne was arrested, and she was taken to the Tower of London. As she entered through the Traitor's Gate, the same place she had arrived once for her coronation, she knew the irony. She denied all the charges, repeatedly, passionately, but her fate was already sealed. 5 men were arrested alongside her, including her brother George, and all were tried for treason. And despite the flimsy evidence, all were found guilty. In the end, Anne stood almost entirely alone. The court that had once bowed before her now prepared to watch her fall. When Anne Boleyn was taken to the Tower of London, she did not go to a dungeon. As a queen, even a disgraced one, Anne was held in the royal apartments, the same luxurious rooms where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. But this time, they were not a palace. They were a prison. The space was sparsely furnished, cold, and stripped of any ceremony. Anne was constantly watched. Her movements, restricted, and her mental state slowly unraveling. She had attendants, yes, but many of them were women loyal to Queen Catherine or selected to report her words and actions back to the king. Despite the psychological torment, Anne retained some basic comforts. She had a bed, private chamber, and access to a garderobe, a kind of medieval toilet, essentially a stone seat over a chute. It wasn't luxurious, but it was far better than the cells for common prisoners. She received several meals brought to her by her attendants, usually consisting of bread, meat, broth, and wine. But Anne often refused to eat. Some days she wept. Other days she laughed uncontrollably. The guards believed she was going mad. She oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the idea that Henry would show mercy, that it was all just a huge misunderstanding. But as the days passed and the men arrested along her were tried and found guilty, she began to understand the truth. There would be no pardon. She spent her final nights praying, writing, and preparing herself for death. And in those cold stone rooms, the once radiant queen, the woman who changed the course of English history, faced the final days of her life, utterly alone. Before Anne Boleyn faced her own end, 5 men were executed in her name, accused of committing adultery with the queen, and therefore committing treason. They were condemned with her, despite a complete lack of credible evidence. And the most shocking name on the list was George Boleyn, Anne's brother. Alongside him was Mark Smeaton, a court musician, the only one to confess, likely under torture. Sir Henry Norris, a trusted courtier and once a close friend to the king. Sir Francis Weston, a young and popular gentleman of the king's privy chamber. And Sir William Brereton, a minor figure politically, but useful for rounding out the list. Their crimes? Being close to the queen. Their sentence? Death by beheading. On May 17, 1536, just outside the tower on Tower Hill, the 5 men were brought out one by one. According to witnesses, they died with dignity. Some professed their innocence. Others, they simply asked for prayers. All of them kept silent about the queen. George Boleyn's final speech was long and eloquent, not a defense of his actions, but a reflection on sin, power, and pride. Whether or not they believed Anne guilty, they all knew this wasn't about love affairs. It was about clearing the way for a new queen. And as the axe fell, the message was clear. No one was safe. Not a brother, not a friend, not even the men closest to the king himself. And now, the tower awaited Anne. While Anne Boleyn sat imprisoned in the tower awaiting her death, King Henry VIII was already planning his next wedding. Just one day after the 5 men were executed, and 2 days before Anne's own beheading, Henry sent word to Jane Seymour, who had been quietly staying at her family's home, Wolf Hall. The message, well, it was incredibly clear. Prepare yourself. Jane was fitted for new gowns. Her household was expanded. She began receiving royal attention, not in secret, but openly. Henry even had plans drawn up for her coronation before Anne had ever even taken her final breath. On May 18th, the day Anne was meant to die, her execution was delayed. But Henry didn't visit. He didn't even write. Instead, he spent the day with Jane. In this, Henry showed not hesitation, but precision. By removing Anne and marrying Jane swiftly, he would close the chapter cleanly. There would be no mourning period, no lingering scandal. After all, Anne's name was already being erased from court records. Her portraits were being taken down, and her memory unmade. And Jane? She was just not the king's new love. She was his redemption, his last hope for a legitimate male heir. To Henry, love had little to do with it. This was politics, legacy, and survival. And Anne Boleyn, well, she was simply in the way. The morning of May 19th, 1536, was cold and still. At first light, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, rose from her bed in the tower for the very last time. She dressed carefully, in a gray gown trimmed with fur and a red petticoat beneath. She placed a simple headdress on her head, and with calm, steady grace, prepared herself for what was to come. Around her, her attendants wept, but Anne, she didn't. She had faced disgrace, betrayal, and the loss of everything she had fought for. Yet in her final hours, she showed a strength that even her enemies couldn't deny. She had requested a French executioner, known for his skill with a sword, a rare act of mercy granted by the very man who had ordered her death. At 8 a.m., Anne was led out to Tower Green within the fortress walls, a private execution away from the jeering crowds. She stepped onto the scaffold with quiet dignity. She knelt on the straw, eyes open, lips moving in silent prayer. She refused a blindfold. The executioner stepped behind her, sword hidden, so that she would never see the final blow coming. And with a single, swift strike, Anne Boleyn was simply gone from the world. The queen who had changed England's fate, who had dared to rise so high, now lay in the cold grass, buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel just yards away from where she had been once crowned with glory. Her story didn't end there, because their daughter, Elizabeth, would one day become the greatest monarch England had ever known. But in that moment, in the silence after the blade fell, Anne Boleyn's extraordinary, tragic life had come to an end. They tried to erase her. They buried her without ceremony. They tore down her banners. They whispered her name with shame, or not at all. But fate had other plans. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, the child whose birth had been such a huge disappointment, whose mother had gone out as a traitor, would rise above it all. In 1558, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England, and not just any queen. She would go on to reign for 45 years, ushering in a golden age of art, exploration, and power. She would become the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor monarch, and one of the most reverend rulers in history. And though she never spoke her mother's name in public, she never forgot her. In every decision she made, in every crown she wore, in every moment of defiant grace, Elizabeth was her mother's daughter, a queen born of a queen. And in Elizabeth's rise, Anne Boleyn's story found its final act, not in shame, not in silence, but in glory. That's it for this video, you guys. Thank you so much for listening in. And if you liked my story, please comment and subscribe and like our video. And if you're still awake, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping that the sounds of the crackling ember will help you fall asleep. Thanks, guys.